Welcome to Case Closed with former Attorney General John Swallow. John Swallow has worked both in the private and public sector, first as a lawyer from a multinational company, and then as the Attorney General of the state of Utah. Even more powerfully, he defended himself against false charges and beat the government to clear his name. John, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, and the government can be that 800-pound gorilla, and it takes a lot to go after them and actually beat them. So it's good to be here with you, and happy to answer any questions you have today.
I know we always say this very casually, like you beat the government, but there's not very many people in the winner's corner when it comes to that.
It's awfully tough to beat City Hall. I will say that for sure. But it can be done if you have the right counsel and a little bit of luck.
Okay. Well, today we're going to talk about something that I would say is relatable to 51% of the married population, which is divorce, but specifically, child custody, along with child support, and how that's all figured out.
Right.
And the first question I just want to throw to you is, how is child support calculated? And I know there's a lot of things that go into it, like health insurance and things like that.
Well, let me just preface my remarks with a couple of things. First of all, I've been fortunate. My wife and I have been married 37 years now, and people say that it's impossible to have marital bliss for that long, and I say it just keeps getting better. And so I'm one of the very fortunate, maybe few, who married right and has a very patient spouse, and I'm grateful for that every day. There are a lot of issues with divorce and with child custody and child support payments and alimony and all of those things. More and more, the states have gotten very aggressive, involved with the Office of Recovery Services for collecting child support. And so, if you go through the divorce process and you are required to pay support and you don't, what's going to happen is it's likely that your spouse is going to go to the state and ask for help with dependency payments, child support payments. And the state's going to get involved, and their lawyers are going to come after you for child support. That's how it's going to work, okay? So, just the other day, I'm talking with a potential client, and I can share this, and he's telling me, I paid my wife child support for the kids in cash for several years. Now she's telling the state that I didn't pay her. And I say, well, did you keep receipts for what you paid her? No, I didn't. I just trusted that she'd be honest with me. You got to protect yourself. You got to be smart. If you're going to pay $1 to your family, to your children, through your spouse, former spouse, you need to pay by check. You need to pay through the system. You need to keep receipts so that you can prove what you've paid. So that when the state comes knocking on your door, you can say, look, I've paid this. Here's the proof that I paid it. Otherwise, you're going to accrue a total that's going to continue to accrue with interest, and the state's going to have their hooks into you, and their lawyers are going to go after you, and you can actually be charged in some states, like in my home state, for what's called criminal non-support, which is a crime, right? So they have all kinds of ways to force you to pay what you're legally obligated to pay. And honestly, we all have an obligation to take care of our children anyway. But I know there are lots of fights in my practice. There have been lots of fights between a former husband and wife or spouses about how much they should pay, how much income they're earning. And to answer your question, I know this has been a long answer.
No, I love it.
But most states have gotten very specific about the amount of child support that's paid based on your income, your former spouse's income, the number of children, and it's basically down to a formula. So it's not nearly as subjective as it used to be. It's more objective, and it's more set in stone based on the statute.
So you're not just going to go in one day almost in mediation and you're not going to negotiate and hash things out. It's already set up for you. You're going to show up and they're going to put it in and spit out a number.
Right. It's going to be a calculation. Now, the problem is, the challenge is the kind of floating number is, what is your income? And so typically what will happen is people will stop working, because they're kind of planning on lowballing what they're kind of required to pay under the child support guidance. They'll just stop working. Or they'll take a good paying job and they'll take a minimum type job, minimum hourly wage type job, to try to influence how the child support calculation is actually calculated. What's important about that is commissioners or judges, they have the power to impute a reasonable income to you based on your education level and your experience level. So that doesn't always work, right? And then also, if there's ever a material change in your circumstance, child support payments are usually set, not in concrete, but they're set in like cold butter,
Okay.
right? Which can be melted, right? And so if there's ever a significant change in your circumstances, then your former spouse can go back into court and say, hey, look, we've either found where there was fraud committed earlier on, or there's been such a change, he's now the CEO of a company, he's making millions of dollars, so we need to adjust that child support payment schedule based on his current or her current income versus what it was set at originally in the divorce decree.
Yeah. So if you want to be almost a little slimy, people out there are saying like, oh, I'm going to just go work at Walmart as a grocery cart collector, and that should be my child support. And then 6 months later, since I have a master's degree, get a better job, and the court says no way.
Right. The judges are very experienced. Opposing counsel is very experienced. They've seen every trick all along. And so you might get away with it for a while, or your spouse may get away with it for a while, but eventually the truth will come out about what your income really is. And it really is a matter of guidelines now. So you can game the system somewhat, but in the end, it usually comes back. And what you want to avoid is someone going back and trying to get you for child support in arrears, where interest can accrue and where it can become quite a burden. It's always best to stay on top of your child support and not get liens on your property, or judgments against you, or heaven forbid, have the state come after you for criminal non-support.
Yeah. Well, I've had some experience in divorce just in my family, and I could see someone like one of my family members who is almost afraid of their ex-spouse, and their ex-spouse not paying child support. So to unpack what you said about the state, she or he could go talk to the state, and the state will come after them, and they don't have to get involved in like a personal lawyer or something like that.
Right. So again, the state becomes very interested whenever one of the spouses tries to go to the state for dependency payments, welfare. We used to call it welfare, right? They start paying money to your former spouse for to support the family, but they also inquire as to whether the child support is being paid, and then they can step into the process and actually get involved with the court to force you to pay your child support. And that's where they have tools like criminal charges that they can file against you, and they can get judgments against you, and they can start to collect. And when I was Attorney General, we had a whole division that worked on that part of collecting money and reimbursement for the state for welfare payments the state would pay to a disenfranchised ex-spouse, wasn't receiving child support. State was paying out welfare payments, and then the state would then step in her shoes and collect for the state and to get reimbursement for the monies the state, taxpayer dollars the state paid out. So, and the state can get very, very aggressive. They have all kinds of tools. They have banks of lawyers just waiting, and judges are very sympathetic to them. And it can become quite an ordeal when you're dealing with the state of Utah instead of your former spouse.
Yeah.
State of Utah, state of California, state of Missouri, whatever state it is.
Well, and another thing, just to step away from the money side, because obviously that money is there to support your kids. How is custody played out? Because I know there's a lot of movements to get fathers more involved and to almost go 50-50, but how is that calculated in the first place?
Right, so state legislatures typically determine the rules for custody, where the children stay overnight, right? And so the typical arrangement is that they try to split it up as equal as possible to, for fairness purposes, but it's almost all set by guidelines, and then that can vary by agreement of the parties. So if the parties can agree to who the primary physical custodian is, someone's got to be the, primary decision maker, and then the gamut is the settlement can be any on a whole continuum of how much right the other partner has, former spouse has, to make decisions about who takes care of the kids, when the kids visit. But if you go with the schedule, it's pretty regimented. It's pretty fairly split. And so, if the best thing to do is try to agree, and if you can't agree, you just fall to the guidelines that the state has for custody and primary physical custody, and all those determinations are made. Now, if a partnership can't agree to any of those things, and both sides want to have primary physical custody of the child, then there are other tools the court has to determine who would be the most appropriate caregiver for the children in terms of, primary physical custody. They can go through child custody evaluators who do home studies to kind of make an independent determination of where the children should be. I will say that who you select for that can make a real difference in terms of how they see what is in the best interest of the children. In extreme cases, the state can appoint an independent person to represent the best interests of the children. That's called a guardian ad litem. And all of these are terms that you may not be familiar with. But there is a process, a very regimented, statutorily created process by the legislature for dealing with these custody and child support issues that are fairly regimented these days, because they've been so manipulated by people historically, that the legislatures have finally gotten wise and said, no, we're going to set these things in concrete. We're going to make people follow these rules unless there's an exception allowed by the judge for exceptional circumstances. Well, in all those cases, a very good family lawyer is very important in that process. And certainly if we can answer any of those questions, you just go to askjohnswallow.com, and my team would be happy to help you figure out a solution to some of those questions that you may have.
It sounds like we've gone over a lot of like how the government will help collect child support. It sounds like it's very regimented in like how things are done. I have an example. This is a coworker I used to have where their divorce lasted 4 years because they were trying to figure out, well, how are you going to split up the children? And, they were giving each other like, oh, I'll give you the house if I get to take Wednesday, or I'll give you the boat if I get to take Saturdays. Like, how are people supposed to go, like, I know this is a very personalized question, but like, how are you supposed to get along for 4 years when you're getting divorced for 4 years on this legal battle?
Right. Well, one family I know and worked with, they took about 3 years to get through their divorce. And for quite a long time during that 3-year period, one of the spouses wanted to be divorced right away. And so sometimes courts will consider what's called a bifurcation of the divorce, which will handle some areas up front and then leave some of the disputed areas for later on. Usually that's the division is between custody and the actual divorce and maybe financial circumstances. One of the things I warn my clients about is that under the laws in my state, the marital estate is not calculated until the date of the divorce. So if they get started on the divorce and it takes 3 years to get through the divorce, and one of the spouses has a lot of a business, it's like going up and up and up and up in value. Sometimes they're shocked at the very end of the process when the valuation is based on the ending date of the marriage instead of the filing date for the divorce. And so that's one of those things you have to be really careful of as you are considering the financial consequences of your personal divorce proceeding. And you want to check with a very experienced family lawyer, divorce lawyer, as you're getting into that process, and make sure that you're very, very well advised. Mm-hmm. In this particular case with one of my clients, we were able to get a bifurcation earlier on, and a decree actually entered early on so they could be divorced and then work out some of the other issues for later in a bifurcation. And that's sometimes the best approach. If one party resists that, then it really is up to the commissioner or the judge about whether they're going to grant the request to bifurcate. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't, and it's really up to the judge.
Okay. Well, I'm going to give you another example. Unfortunately, I know a lot of divorced people, but this divorce, so they primarily lived in Minnesota, and then one of them just moved to Utah, and it was a blended family, so they took their kids, the other kids stayed in Minnesota. How does a divorce work when you're across state lines? Because I feel like...
Yeah, that's also very complicated, and it really depends on the state laws. But there are laws that deal with the jurisdiction where the children have lived for certain periods of time before the divorce is filed. And almost every state has some kind of a residency requirement before you can actually file for divorce in that state. Some states are less time, some states are more time. So what you want to do is whatever state you're in, you want to consult with a good, experienced family practitioner and find out what the rules are in your state and where the jurisdiction is going to be for the children for custody issues and where the jurisdiction is appropriate for the filing of the divorce.
Yeah, it seems like divorce is almost a case by case.
State by state, case by case thing. It's more state by state because more and more, like I said, the legislatures have really drilled in on the process for how custody is determined, child support amounts, and those types of issues because they want more predictability when someone goes into a divorce to see how the outcome will work. And I think that they've determined that the more predictability that there is, the less likely there's going to be an abuse of the system. And in family law, probably more than any other area, it's just ripe for abuse and manipulation. And I've never seen an area of the law in all my years that is more divisive and destructive than in the breakup of a marriage. And it's unfortunate that the two people that loved each other so much can be so adverse and so spiteful and hateful. The allegations that go back and forth, sometimes truthful, sometimes concocted allegations of spousal abuse or child abuse. I mean, it runs the gamut and it's just horrific, the types of stories that are told, sometimes true, sometimes false, against another spouse to gain an advantage in a divorce proceeding.
Yeah, and it seems like in family law, I've heard this saying where family law is when you see the best people in their worst days and on their worst behavior, where in criminal law, you see the worst people on their best days and at their best behavior.
That is well said. That is really well said. I've seen it, and it's just a terrible thing on both counts, right?
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like the state's very invested in making sure that the children are taken care of and making sure at the end of the day that maybe people don't feel like they're whole, but the children are, I guess, completed or make sure that they're on a pathway to, have a life.
Yeah, I don't think there's any way to say that there's much of a good outcome in divorce for the kids.
Yeah.
But the state does its best to make sure that the interests of the children, the best interests of the children, are at the forefront. And that's why courts will not hesitate to appoint what's called a guardian ad litem to just exclusively look out for the best interests of the children. Often a guardian ad litem will hire a home evaluator to come in, look at both households, and give a report about which household they think would best support the needs of the children. And that can be paid for by the state, that third-party guardian ad litem. And that's how committed states are to making sure that the kids' best interests are looked after in a divorce. And it happens a lot.
Yeah, and is a guardian ad litem where they are at their grandparents' house, or are they held by social workers or?
No, that's when the state comes in and actually takes custody of the children, which is more rare in a divorce. But the guardian ad litem is just a special person who works in the guardian ad litem's office, whose job is to make sure the kids are being treated in their best interests. So they're really an advocate for the children. So you'd have the attorney representing the mother or one spouse, the attorney representing the other spouse, another attorney, and then the guardian ad litem, whose only job is to protect the children and make sure that they're giving input into the court and feedback to the court about, from a neutral standpoint, what's best for the children. That's the job of the guardian ad litem. They just look out for the children's best interest, not for mom, not for dad, but for the children.
Well, John,
that's not always the case, but when a guardian ad litem is appointed, that's the job.
Well, John, it seems like we've really sucked the marrow out of all of this. We really got in deep and trying to figure out definitions and how things work. Thank you so much because I'm sure there's people out there who need to hear this from, a former attorney general and not just, I feel like, your average lawyer.
Well, thanks. We did have a responsibility in my office to make sure that child support was paid. And the advice I'd give anybody is just make sure you're following the rules. And make sure if you're paying child support, you're getting a receipt for what you pay so that you're not paying twice, right? And because you will be held accountable for child support one way or another. The obligation just doesn't go away. The state just won't let go, and the obligation will accrue, it will bear interest, and it will be following you around like a boat anchor on your neck for the rest of your life if you don't pay your child support. So pay it.
Yeah, I think that's very actionable advice. Well, and again, thank you so much, because I know that this is helping someone out there. And
Great.
thank you for joining us with former Attorney General John Swallow on Case Closed.